Well, hello everyone, and welcome to another edition of Learn with Samford. And as many of you know that I know follow my podcast, Cuba is a special interest for me, and I was very honored. We had a fundraising event at the Peoria Area Country Club last week. And Dennis Triggs, a member of ours, got up and spoke to all of these really influential people in Peoria and said, I'm safe to say that I think Don Samford knows more than anyone in Illinois about Cuba. What I should have said, there is one other, Paul Johnson. And that's my guess. So, so I took that as a distinct honor, but I can't really make the claim. So I have Paul Johnson from the United States Ag Coalition for Cuba. I've been fortunate enough to travel a couple of times with his group to Cuba, and that's helped give me a lot of information. So, Paul, welcome and thank you for joining me today.
My pleasure. It's great to see you again.
All right. Well, let's get into it. And first, for my viewers, I'd like you to tell a little bit of your background and how Cuba became, say, a significant part of your life.
The first time I went there was in 1995. I was curious. It was warm. I live in Chicago, so good place to go during the winter. It was communist. It was forbidden. I didn't understand it. I wanted to learn more. My father always taught me to go into the void. So I went and really liked it. It piqued my curiosity. Went back again in 1999 to live there. I wrote a master's thesis on the economic development of Cuba. Wrote that there and met some really important connections, learned the language, and just stayed connected with the people I had met during that time. Went back every Christmas. And then in 2008, I went back again to study anthropology, looking for like really as an excuse to look for business opportunities. I found those opportunities, came back to Chicago, started a company, started exporting food to the Cuban government and different retail chains throughout the island, learned something about agriculture, uh, exporting, and used that knowledge to consult and grow the business. Started a coalition called the U.S. Ag Coalition for Cuba, and that advocates with folks in DC and in Cuba to improve our agricultural relations. And then on the commercial side, continue to make inroads to help people look to expand, open new markets, and to help local production in Cuba. Along the way, I met my wife in Cuba, and we have two boys, and so you know how it goes, right? You pick your head up, and 30 years goes by, and this has become my profession.
All right. Cuba and the United States are both lucky to have you involved as you are. Some of my viewers may not know that the significance of Illinois and Cuba. And so could you cover a little bit about with the hurricane and Governor Ryan and why Illinois is kind of different than most places with its connections?
You know, Governor Ryan was the first governor while there we had an embargo with Cuba to visit the island. Republican, of course. And that was a really significant trip because he got some folks together here in Illinois, including some big agricultural companies. And they went down there and they wanted to open the doors to exporting food. And so what came of that trip, that historical trip, was an opportunity to work with folks here in Illinois and then other companies and in DC to persuade Congress to pass a law, which we now have, that's been with us for 25 years, called the Trade Sanction Reform and Export Enhancement Act, that allows us to export food to Cuba legally. And it was historic. And I remember I was actually in Cuba. I remember I was at a lunch counter and I'm listening to the radio in Havana, and through the Spanish, it's Governor Ryan of Illinois. And I couldn't believe it. I couldn't believe that our governor actually came down, and it was historic just for the occasion itself, that high level meeting that he had with Fidel Castro. And then, like I said, what came from it has really helped define my career.
And I think at one time, I think it was both corn and soybeans. Wasn't 100% of what Cuba used to buy came from Illinois?
Still, I'm well, we do $480 million in sales last year, agricultural exports from US, United States to Cuba, 480 million.
Mhm.
About 65% of that is poultry meat. We have done some soy more in the form of course, feed and in frying oil. Not as much as we had before, sort of comes and goes.
A lot of that had to do with having to have hard cash and no credit was what I was told by some of the farm groups here is why we don't sell what we did initially with Governor Ryan.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned the hurricane, going back to that, and that was important because that really was another opening for us to pass that law because it was seen as humanitarian, even though it was commercial in nature. There was a big hurricane that hit Cuba, and they were in need of some humanitarian assistance, and I like that way of providing that assistance, humanitarian aid in the form of not only donations, which are important, but my interest is commercial relations to improve the situation in Cuba and provide opportunities for our farmers here.
And I don't know if my viewers know, but I still own the family farm in southeastern Illinois, so I'm still very interested in expanding markets for uh, corn, soybeans, and they also grow Milo on my ground now too. So
Hmm.
we'll take a market for anything at this moment. And I will say that I'm always looking when I go to the Cuban markets for the poultry from the United States, and I say there's a very good chance Paul Johnson facilitated that. That's why it's here. So, and I always tell my groups about you and the ability to get quite a bit of that food down there for
Thank you.
them.
I think
Right.
if you want to get some Milo down there, you have to educate people what Milo is
I
first.
could say yes. That's very true. That'll be a whole nother session. Okay, so I'll have the guy that fires my ground. We'll do that then. So talking about humanitarian aid, let's get right into your last visit in March, and I'd like to hear your observations of what's going on in Cuba right now.
It's pretty dire, right? I was there in March, like you said, and I had been there 4 months previous to that. December, and the difference between December and March was, marked. I mean, it was bad in December. It's been
I was there in
deteriorating.
December, yeah, and I thought, gosh, I don't know if it can get a whole lot worse, but it did.
It was surprising, right? I mean, it was like you said, it was bad, but I think back in December there were rolling blackouts,
Yes.
and that was impacting rural Cuba more than anything. But Havana was still sort of functioning with a 4 hour of no electricity, and they were rotating that. And then fast forward to March, and they hadn't received any oil in 4 months. One tanker from Russia was delivered about 3 weeks ago, but other than that, that was it. So um, it's the streets are dark. There's very few cars. At night, it's eerie, going home because there's no lights. And now Cuban in Havana doesn't have light for up to 20 hours a day, sometimes more. Rural Cuba in the country, it's, worse. And then it's important to note, from a country that's totally dependent on uh, oil to feed its electricity grid, what that does, it's not just about being in the dark. But inside the home, it's difficult to get running water if it's pumped into your home. So you're, showering and cleaning your food. And then there's a lack of cooking gas. So people are using these small little like barbecues that they put in their house, and it's sort of it's crazy. It impacts people psychologically because you're waiting for the lights to go on if they're going to go on. You're sort of building your day around these 4 hours of light where you can maybe watch some TV and certainly charge your phone or connect to the computer to see what's happening to communicate with other ones outside the country. Refrigeration, right? Food spoils really quickly. So inside the home, it has a profound impact, specifically on agriculture. Outside the home, cold chain storage is pretty much wiped out. So storing food in refrigeration is not really an option. Getting food from the fields to markets is they're not doing it. I mean, they do what they can, but there's no diesel, there's no gas, very little. They suspended bus service because they don't have enough fuel. So the work productivity has gone down. So it sort of spirals out of control. People aren't producing in the fields. They're not getting the food to the markets. It's challenging for people to access food because getting to the markets is tough. Things are really expensive because the supply is so low. On the black market, you can get a gallon of gas for $40, which I mean, I paid 5 at Costco and I was like grumbling the entire time. But imagine 40. So all
And the
that's,
fact that they don't have I mean, the income for the average Cuban, trying to remember December, they were telling us was, is it like $33 a month, I think, at that time.
it's probably less now
Yeah, I would
because
guess
of
so too.
inflation. It's
Yeah.
around the average salary for a Cuban is about 6,500 pesos a month. And if you were to exchange those pesos on the informal market, which is about 500 to 1.
I could say that's it. That's been going up since I was there in December. Yeah.
All right.
Wow.
So what was it,
Yeah.
$12? Somewhere,
Yeah.
12,
Yeah.
15, just somewhere in there. And then,
Yeah. Gee.
so there's lack of food. And then to your point, what money you do have and what food there is, it becomes increasingly difficult to purchase. If you're a retired nurse living on a pension, you get about 2,500 pesos a month. It's about $5.
Man.
You can't even get a quarter liter of oil with that. On top of that, because there's such underproduction, the economy is where it's at. The Cuban government isn't purchasing food like they had in the past. The private sector is, which is great, but that's really the only source of food for people. There's agricultural markets, food's still going there, life continues, but it's expensive.
Boy, I I know when if you don't get remittances, if you do not have money coming from the United States, I just don't know how those people are even surviving. And they're the people too that are less likely to be able to emigrate from Cuba. And they're the ones I think of oftentimes are like we talked about the hidden poor in the 1960s. Um, if they're out in the countryside, um, they're in area of the cities where the tourists don't go. And there's got to be a significant number of them. And my heart goes out to them. I just don't know how Cubans are ingenious though, aren't they?
Being resilient, but it's getting bad. It's getting a little more desperate. um, you know, rural Cuba, right? There's not a lot of people farming. That's been decreasing. 15% of the country lives in the countryside in Cuba. So we're concerned that we've lost a generation of farmers, people moving to out of the country or into the cities. The ration system that people relied on, the government would provide highly subsidized food, is not working. Maybe you get some bread, whatever what little they have. So to your point, yeah, I mean it's they're resilient, they can survive, but now they got a lot going up against them. So we've seen rising food insecurity. 40% is what USDA estimated back in 2024. I'm sure it's more acute now.
Yeah.
Um, and then of course medical care and just going to the hospital when there's blackouts. They keep some lights on in the hospitals. They do use what they have, but they're suspending surgeries because they don't have enough light or certainly medicine. There's rising disease that goes with food insecurity, lack of nutrition, rising rates of anemia. We're seeing people burn trash in the streets because they can't collect it fast enough. And imagine the respiratory illness that can come from that. And then the three mosquito viruses that are still a factor in Cuba. It seemed like it's impacted everybody. So the elderly and the youth is who are being impacted the most, and we saw that in the 90s when the Soviet Union collapsed. It's similar to what is happening now. And we know that those health consequences are going to be with us for generations to come.
Yeah, the December I our guide and he said just the pain, the aching. was so bad, and he still was having trouble walking with knees. So yes, you're right. There's two or three different diseases they just can't seem to shake down there. Um, well, let's get into your report because I thought it was pretty good. And I'll hold this up for my viewers here. I ran a copy of it here. This really helped me get a sense, a better, I think, visual handle on where we are with some of the food situation. When I was talking to my friends there and our tour directors and guide in particular, who I've gotten to know real well. Their frustration was in the farming sector that they just don't, they didn't make the changes they needed for farmers to invest and produce. And they said the same thing you did. We're losing people that even have the capability, have the experience of farming. So I did hear that. But let's go ahead and have you give me the highlights of your report. What stood out to you that you shared with people through this report?
Well, first of all, in the agricultural production, the figures were alarming to say the least. I'll give you some highlights. 90% of the pork herd's gone. 90% of the poultry flock is decimated. And that has a lot to do with mismanagement, lack of feed, lack of vaccines. Um, Tropical fruit production down 60%. Sugar production is, I mean, it's the low as it's been since like 1898, right? So on and on across the board, bean production down 60%, dairy production is maybe they produce 20% of what they need. I think it's probably lower than that. Rice, which is really important to the Cuban diet, they can produce less than 10% to meet the national need. So the production figures were stunning. They've been bad for a while. And there's a lot of reasons. And a lot of that has to do with the Cuban government and their mismanagement. You touched on it. Uh, they don't put enough resources into agriculture. They're still continuing to build hotels, waiting for tourism to turn. Frustrates everybody, particularly when you're living in a big city in Havana and you got no lights, and you look down the street and you got the hotel that's lit up. So
Oh,
it's
that
frustrating.
yeah, the one that was I think the most recent one that goes just skyrockets up through there, and for a historical preservationist and what sells Havana, I'm like them. We were at a reception with an art group, the Ludwig Foundation, and from the top of their building, you just see all these five-star hotels with, you know, some lights on but very few rooms with lights. It's more of the lobbies and so on. And you're right. That was a bone of contention, how the Army just keeps building these five-star hotels and nobody's in them. So I had to interrupt because that was such a major point that was being made to the Cubans that I talked to down there.
Yeah, it's a slap in the face. So mismanagement, poor decisions from the government. They don't act quick enough to meet the moment. Zigzagging in policies, delaying of announcing policies, and then delaying the regulations until a year or more afterward. And particularly in agriculture, they don't allow the cooperatives to do as much as they could. There's no money. They're not paying them for the goods that they contracted for. Of course, lack of inputs and the fuel now, how that impacts tractors and irrigation and whatnot. That's exasperated the problem. So this system isn't working. They can do a lot more with it. That really what struck me. It's the lack of agricultural production and then digging into the reasons behind that. And it's not the embargo, no doubt, has an impact, but the Cuban government has an equal amount to bear too. Another thing that was interesting outside the production, the low production, was U.S. exports to Cuba. So, as I mentioned, $480 million of agricultural goods were exported to Cuba last year, and 70% is my estimation. 70% of that was purchased by the private sector in Cuba.
That stood out to me.
And that's remarkable because in 2021, that was zero. So in a short amount of time, 5 years, we've gone from zero to 70%. And it very well could be 100% right now. But I was
Wow.
being conservative with 70 based on um, anecdotal information, conversations with exporters, and the government did do some reporting about what they percentages of what they purchased year over year since 2021, and it was a so 70% is conservative.
Wow.
But what it shows is that there is a private sector in Cuba. They have money. Cuba changed their constitution in 2021 to expand the private sector to include small and medium-sized enterprises. And since that moment, you can look at the numbers. Our sales to Cuba have increased. The variety of goods that we're selling to Cuba has been amplified, increased, and they're purchasing majority. So that's the positive note, and I believe the way forward out of this crisis, and a way to bring both countries together is through their private sector.
Um, Amen on that. I I was surprised, and again, it was interesting because I could tell that Alan and Morgan, tour director and guide, were both watching my face when I first got there in December, as going around because I think they wanted me to talk about what changes I had seen in 2 years. And oftentimes my mouth was just like, as we're driving out, as you said, the lack of vehicles, even in December, was shocking. And December is one of the peak tourist months, and the lack of tourists from previous trips. And it's of course worse now than that. But the other thing was how successful the private business was from 2 years ago. So
Mhm.
here I'm looking at one horrible, and you're exactly right. And I have my pictures because they would always point out to me the beautiful Cadillac Escalades, the BMWs, saw Porsche. Uh, I actually, great picture, a brand new red Mustang, Ford Mustang. And on the way to Matanzas, I saw a brand new Dodge Ram. Vehicles I have never seen in Cuba. I saw a few luxury SUVs 2 years ago, but the change in automobiles and more small SUVs of different brands in Verdado, the more affluent area. You almost immediately saw who the private business was versus the non and the vehicles. And the other thing I saw, brilliant entrepreneur, obviously, the number of motorcycles and motor scooters that
Mhm.
recognizing a gasoline issue will bring this in, had not seen them in that kind of scale. So yes, so I wanted to throw my observations in there, just that those two worlds have become very, very dramatic. And that's not good for Cuba either, um, because of the
It's
class, that'll only format issues if you don't make other private changes. Your observation?
Yeah, I think they're trying to address that. Look, you're right. The divide is stark between the haves and the have-nots. It's been there for a while, but now it's increasing. You could see a Cuban, to your point, picking through trash, and then as you're watching that guy, an SUV drives by with a Cuban there, and he's obviously better off. But look, that's the process, right? I think to move forward, we need to keep young, entrepreneurial, dynamic
Yes.
entrepreneurs in Cuba to rebuild their country. I think they have this idea that they want to help contribute to social development as well. We should allow them to do that. I think they can fix their problems better than anybody else. Uh, Also important to note culturally, this private sector and this growing group that has access to remittances and dollars and is growing and can alleviate some of the daily problems because they do have access to money. They can buy groceries at private stores because they have the money. They may even be able to afford the gas in the black market.
Yep.
Is that number one? There's a shift within Cuba over generations going from a socialist mentality to a more capitalistic. And I've seen that transition at the around the kitchen table where you might have a grandmother or a mom and dad whose son or grandkid is now in the private sector. And not everyone approved of that because of how they were brought up to think of the private sector in terms of exploitation of the masses. And now, they're changing their mind in a very short amount of time because, it's I relate it to us going to the U.S. Postal Service, and no one likes to be in that line, right? You're wondering, why am I here? Why can't I just go to FedEx? And it's a similar experience in Cuba. So now that there's more private sector stores and whatnot and services, Cubans are realizing that they get better service with the private sector and they have more products. So the grandma and the mother and father that maybe look down or were concerned about their kids going into the private sector have had a change of heart. So
Wow.
that's really important in a country that's been living for 65 years under a socialist model to accept those changes and embrace it. Beyond that, I think it's important to note of how the private sector in Cuba is educating other Cubans about what it is like to work in today's world.
Yeah.
Uh, if it was raining in Cuba 10, 15, 20, 30 years ago, maybe you don't go to work. Certainly you show up late. And now you got these entrepreneurs who, time is gold. So they are educating workers what it's like to work for 40 hours a week and be held accountable. Also, I've seen this at the government level where they're trying to teach people to empower them to make decisions because previously you had Fidel Castro made the decisions for everybody and educated people on what was going on, but they didn't necessarily make decisions for themselves. So you're seeing that, and you're seeing leadership encourage individuals to make decisions for themselves and empowering them to do that, which is going to, bring the country forward. Um, Also, about this divide that you're talking about, Cuba, from their perspective, they saw what happened when the Soviet Union collapsed and the oligarchs and what that meant for the future of Russia. And so they've taken those lessons to heart, and they're certainly concerned about that. Probably one of the reasons of many that they've been so slow into to change. Also important to note that the people who are supporting the private sector in Cuba is Miami, right? It's the Cuban
Yeah.
Americans. We only are focused on the big divide between the two camps, which is real. But we don't talk about the Cuban Americans that are sending $3 to $7 billion in remittances a year that have been poured into this private sector. And I think that's really important for both countries. Last thing, at least for now, I'll say about this divide you talk about is Cuba's formula, their model moving forward is about a mixed economy where they're going to have the state sector merge with the private sector to create joint ventures and use the know-how and the capital of the private sector, use that with the assets of the state sector, warehousing and land and such, to grow their economy. And I think that's the model we should expect moving forward. And I mean, I like to see that evolve more, but I think it creates opportunities for everybody.
Um, I was really privileged on one of the trips down there with you when we were staying at the Hotel Nacional, and Ricardo Torres, who I just thought was a brilliant economist. And I appreciated the opportunity where I got quite a chance to ask most of the questions and engage in conversation with him. And I see he's in the United States now. I watched some of it. I like, hopefully we'll have him on this uh, um, podcast to also discuss how he would structure maybe an economic system because I have such high respect for him. But one of the things I asked him was what, after seeing China and Vietnam and these countries where it everything was going to collapse like Russia, but they went ahead and made the change to a larger amount of private enterprise. Um, why didn't they see that model? And he shook his head and says, I just don't think that they will. And then I had William Leo Grand in who co-author of Back Channel to Cuba was my second guest on my podcast, and he commented that China was not going to uh, put any more money down a sinkhole until Cuba uh, adjusted to something like the Vietnamese model. And that's what I'm hearing you saying. And I agree. I've thought all along that made the most sense for Cuba because, as you said, most of the people that I talked to in Cuba, and I enjoyed my visit where we went with you to your wife's family and the people there. And Anthony De Palma did a great book about the three communities there. That so many of the people still believe in the revolution, in the ideas of the revolution. And so it's not that they want to just get rid of everything and it's just they want the government to make better decisions. Is I constantly heard that. We just want them to make better decisions. My frustration looking at what you said is how slow they seem to be to want to move to that Vietnam model or whatever model. And I think you write about that and Cuba land law. I appreciated that in your report here. Um, but I'm hopeful you talk with government officials. Are you hopeful that that speed is going to pick up?
Speed is a key word. I think that's it. Look, in 2010, 11, presidents at the time, Raul Castro, came out and made a speech about reforms. And he had said that they would make these reforms sin prisa, pero sin pausa, without haste, but without pause. And it's been frustrating because there's been way too many pauses and not enough prisa, not enough hurry. Uh, but that's their pace. And speed and pace is really important because on our side right now, we are demanding a complete change quickly. Time is gold. That's our mentality here in the United States. We're right. That's how I view things. But in Cuba, it's very different. And they want to do things at their own pace. They have other concerns. A third of the country is employed in the private sector, but two-thirds is not. So what happens to the two-thirds of the employment? How do they get paid and fed? The oligarchs in Russia, I mentioned, is a concern to them. Maintaining control is a big part of the calculus. The embargo itself and what it means. There's a relation to Cuba being the last country in the world to open up to market reforms and also being the country with the longest embargo from the United States, right? There's a correlation there. So if we were to release the pressure, they'd probably change a little quicker. Um, I think all of that kind of factors in. We'd like to see them make changes quicker, but the more that we insist that they make changes quicker, the more they resist. So there's a cultural aspect to this speed, timing, approach that becomes really important, and also understanding the internal politics and concerns, realities of the economy of Cuba, where they resist this change and they don't want to happen as quick. So it's happening. It's clear to me that it has made important inroads. They changed the Constitution in 2021.
Yeah.
I think the concern right now is that the government will go backwards. I don't share that concern. I think the government is on a course to change. They went back in 2008 to look for a reason that they can adopt more market reforms into a socialist economy. And they found the reasoning through Lenin, who had talked about a mixed economy and state
Yeah.
companies in the private sector. And so they found the model within the communist ideology to make the reasoning for them to move forward. And they've been making progress. Today, 15% of Cuba's GDP is due to the private sector, and that was zero in 2021. So we're seeing the progress, but from our perspective here in the United States, and certainly those in Cuba, it's just not happening fast enough to our frustration.
Again, my friends in Cuba this last trip, I thought they made a really good point to me. They said Fidel understood that there were certain key things you had to do to make the people happy. And I'll preface before I get into the three things that he figured out with that. My interest in Cuba came when I was in college and did a paper in my Latin American political theory class on whether Fidel Castro was a nationalist or a communist. And it's the biggest paper I've ever done, 25-page paper. And the fact that I got an A and my instructor kept my paper for reference has kept me forever interested. And so when I was at the Cuban embassy with you a little about a year and a half ago, I was sharing this with some of the Cuban diplomats there, and I knew this would be a good laugh for them. They said, "Well, what'd you figure out?" And I says, "He was a nationalist. He never understood communism. He was clueless on economics. He was a great political theater guy, but he loved Cuba. He was a nationalist." And they say, "Well, of course, in Cuba, you know what you get." I go, "And I get an F." Um, but I preface that because I've studied this so much and followed it ever since that time. Uh, that Castro really was not a good man. He wasn't a good thinker. He wasn't a good planner. He wasn't a good. That's why he had two. He had other generals who actually won on the battlefield. But the key was, and I think they were completely correct in this: free education, free health care, and food through the ration card so you never went hungry. And the education was quality, the health care was quality, and the food was enough to, keep you satisfied. You didn't go hungry. Those are three key elements, and those all are failing right now. And I thought the point they told me, they said that is what's going to cause unrest among the people, not a revolution, but unrest. And there's a difference there, a frustration that the system isn't working, and now you look at the leaders differently. Also, they're not a Castro, well, Raul, but Diaz-Canel is kind of the figurehead, but they look at that different, and I think that's where they're in trouble. That And I think they care about the people. I know we'd have some of our government say, well, they're all in at power. I think the Cuban government really cares about the people. It's just you and I would agree that their decision-making process is really bad. Um, so I think it's at some point, and I want to hear your response on this, that they're gonna have to worry that when people are starving and there is no work, it's hard not to get frustrated and vent in some manner. So I think they're aware of that. I'd like your take on my observation.
Yeah, I mean it's failing, right? I hate no one likes to hear that word, but when you can't supply food, when you don't have fuel, when you don't have enough teachers to educate or enough supplies, when your hospitals are broken, your healthcare system's broken, you start to question the government itself because they're not providing the basic services that they have to. So that's real. The frustration's real. The Where we're at is real. I think the government, a lot in the government recognize it. You're hearing them complain openly more, hoping for more reforms. Um, but what's holding us back, in my opinion, isn't that the Cuban government's corrupt or taking money and bringing in offshore accounts, which is being part of the narrative being told. I don't think that's the big concern. I see it as one is that just this relationship to the United States and Cuba and the amount of pressure that it has on government decisions to reform and open up their government. And I think this touches back to what you were talking about in that paper you wrote. Was Fidel a nationalist or was he a communist? I think part of the answer can be found in the historical relationship between the United States and Cuba. And up until Fidel was elected, he was the first elected uh, president of Cuba that was really popular amongst the people, and not a president that was appointed by or given the power from the United States. And that's really important
And
because
the early years were pretty good. The literacy program they did, there was a lot of good stuff that I think people forget for the common Cuban uh, that their life got better.
yeah, I would agree. I think there's other people who I would take the other stance in that, but I think so. I mean, I think look, there was people here in the United States in 1959 and 1960 that were cheering on Fidel Castro, right? I mean, we
The
all love the
U.S.
underdog.
ambassador to Cuba at the time said the U.S. should support him. He thought that it was a revolution that was necessary, and that he believed that yeah, it would be something that would get rid of the corrupt Batista and cruel
That's right.
government and support. But then
Yeah,
the word communist came in.
even Rubio. I mean, even Rubio's family, and his story. I mean, they didn't leave because of Fidel Castro was in power, as that story's been told. They left because of Batista, and people who left to come to the United States, a lot of them before felt like they were that Fidel Castro was a traitor to their cause, and before that, they were supportive of it because they wanted a new leadership in Cuba. They wanted to be local. They wanted to be someone that was came from their own. They didn't want to be a puppet government to the United States. And it's
And
important
most thought it was a democracy. They were fighting for democracy. The first 3 years, Cienfuegos, the Bacardi family, El Finance, there were so many people that fought in that movement that were fighting for democracy. And so then that's the second wave that leaves when he nationalizes. And then Cienfuegos, he gets rid of in a mysterious plane crash. The so we forget that stretch in there that there was hope for democracy and a betterment for the people, and it was looking on track, and then he makes, for his own reasons, which I don't have time, and I my paper dealt with it, but but there is that change that goes on. But initially, it looks good, but boy, now just
well, I know now, right? I think though there's parallels and there's lessons to learn from the past about where we are now that we can kind of understand the psyche of the Cuban government and what they're looking to do and try to do. And that parallel we can find in 1898, right? I mean, the Spanish-American War, where the United States was decisive. They came into the war, Rough Riders, Teddy Roosevelt. We all know the story. Remember the Maine, to hell with Spain. Cuba, the United States came into the war and decided it within 3 to 6 months. And then we had two provisional governors, military governors in Cuba.
yeah.
Um, and then after that, we had two, that was 1900, let's see, 1898 to 1901. And then Cuba became a republic in 1902. And the United States came back in 1906 and had two more provisional governors, not military, but um, provincial governors. One of them was Howard Taft, the future president of the United States. And my point here is twofold. One, that this is the history, the long history that Cuba remembers, and
Yes.
they're concerned about in their actions today. And then we have a president, this administration who's talking about owning Cuba, taking it. And it's not new to them. It's new to us, but it's not new to Cubans because they remember their history. And we've done it. I mean, we politically owned Cuba. We had the four provincial governors running the island politically. Economically, we Cuba was completely dependent on the US market for their sugar exports. To increase sugar, they were completely dependent on US capital. So economically, we did control the country of Cuba. We owned it politically and economically.
Yeah.
And so that is still fresh in the Cubans' memory. And I think it has a big part in why they're so slow to reform today.
Your comments have been great today, Paul. Just exactly what I was looking for too, because I think we got more down into the everyday people and here coming, because I know I'm running out of time and you're a busy guy, to the history. Ada Ferrer's book, I just thought was outstanding on American history in Cuba, and very good point. I made this point to my groups when I lead them. I said 1959 to now is an unusual time period in Cuban history. It's outside of the Bay of Pigs and the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's the first time that Cuba's really been Cuba on its own. Because we go back to the founding of our country. I mean, there were Cubans that came and fought with Americans in the American Revolution, but especially the slave owners, the number of plantations. And I was telling my group we went to Matanzas. I says, this area you're looking all south here, Matanzas and Matanzas, it was pretty much all American-owned plantations. Uh, the history just goes on, and with the sugarcane industry and then the Hershey Town, the King Ranch down there. And then we go up to the Batista years with the mob rule. But Americans have just kind of always thought of Cuba as, and we've wanted Cuba as a possession. And you're right. We even if you teach it, you forget your history unless you're me and I teach it, and because I teach it every day, or I can remember it. The average person, I do a presentation, I share this with them, but I know most of them 5, 10 years. I mean, they've got life to go on if you're not hit it over and over again. But the history is a crucial element. And you're right. They know that history. We don't. And I think you've made a very good point. This is the dilemma. How to work with that government to make it better. I think Obama had it right because I saw the Cubans excited. They saw freedom, more freedom coming. They saw more pressure on their government, and they were seeing people coming in and seeing a different life, and that was helping to change their mind on things. And I thought there was the chance we had to have a more peaceful, gradual change. And I always comment if there would have been no U.S. embargo, Fidel Castro probably would have been overthrown because they would have immediately seen it's our government that's the issue. It's not the U.S. embargo.
Mm.
They're now seeing that the embargo, yes, is an issue, but they are seeing the government is an issue now. And I think that's where some pressure is going to come. Some final observation. I wish I could go on forever with you, Paul. As you know, I appreciate your observation so much, but I'll let you finish up with any like key thoughts or observations you'd like to make to leave with my audience.
It is a important moment. Everyone I talked to on the street and the government in Cuba had the same observation. Something's got to change. And I think it's going to happen under this administration. And the reason for that is because of Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's Cuban American. This is his lifelong dream well, end the regime in Cuba. But from his perspective, his motivation, his desire to do what he's always wanted to do, um, countered with Cuba's slow pace and their historical apprehensions and the rest of it, we have this dilemma. It's very clear what the intentions are from the United States. It's very clear what Cuba wants to do. There's a middle ground that's really important that I hope to um, highlight, and that's around agriculture and resolving the food crisis and how we can work with Cuba and their private sector to rebuild their country and so on and so forth. But I'll leave you with this is the moment, whether we like it or not, agree or disagree. I think it's incredibly important that we have a Cuban American as Secretary of State who is going to lead this charge. And I'm happy for it. I don't know how he's going to land it, but it's much better to enact change, to talk about the change, than to do what we've done in the last 65 years, which is basically nothing. So I would tell your audience to watch what Rubio does.
Yeah, I think it has to be done in this administration. Um, that there is, Trump is right. I think he's doing things that no other president would have done to get off the thing. Agree or disagree with him, but it is a change. I will say Venezuela has surprised me a little bit. I understand that that government is wanting to survive and stay in power, but they are making some changes that I did not think I would see at this point. I kind of wonder if Cuba will look and say, well, okay, you know. they're maintaining power, but they are working with the U.S. for some things here to help the economy, which it needs to grow there. So that friendship they had with Venezuela, I'm kind of hopeful that that'll be a lesson they'll take. And you're right that Rubio can come in and maybe not be Mr. Authoritarian and say, what can we do? But no, I agree with you completely. So again, Paul Johnson of the U.S. Ag Coalition for Cuba, and I think we should take all of my Illinois farmer friends down there, and we could feed that entire island with our own agriculture knowledge. So hopefully we'll resolve that humanitarian crisis. I definitely want to have you back on at a later point because I'm sure change will be going on. I'll get your assessment. So, again, Paul, thank you. Any final words?
Always a pleasure to see you and talk to you. I look forward to the next one.
All righty. Thank you. And thank you all for joining us today.